Brilliant. Okay, I think, look, we'll get started. People are still joining, but yeah, we'll get cracking with the start of it. So welcome everyone who has just joined. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are logging in from. And welcome to our first ever BioTalent Social live panel discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of artificial intelligence in healthcare. You can expect an hour of a panel discussion with a live Q&A throughout. If you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A box and we will go through as many of them as possible at the end. My name is Darren. I will be the host and chair for this webinar. Essentially, the reason behind BioTalent Social is we want to connect our network by discussing the relevant topics impacting our industry. And our aim today is to discuss how artificial intelligence has been impacting and will continue to impact the healthcare industry across medical devices, clinical trials, drug discovery, and more. We want to make the discussion as engaging as possible. So again, if you do have any questions for our panel throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them either in the side panel or in the Q&A section, and we'll get through as many of those as possible. Lastly, before we kick things off, just please note that this is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our BioTalent Social YouTube channel. So if you do miss any of it, you will have full access to this webinar and any upcoming webinars in the future. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our amazing panel that we have here tonight, who are currently based in London, New York, and Paris. So you've got a very international panel with us here tonight. Guys, we'd love to know more about the audience as well. So please do tell us where you're located throughout the world. Drop a message in the chat box. Tell us where you are tuning in from. And now over to our panel. So if you could, I suppose, introduce yourself, your role, your experience, and make it a bit interesting and tell us a fun lockdown hobby that you took up in the last year. So let's get started with Claire. Claire Bihar, we'll open it up with you.
Thanks, Darren. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here with you tonight or in the morning, again, depending of your time zone. I'm the co-founder of Tulsi, which is a startup project starting in 2017 around the mobile app for aromatherapy to prevent intoxication with essential oils. And also I joined very recently this month a new French startup called Resilience Care in oncology and AI. Regarding a fun lockdown activity, I guess it was trying to cook because I'm not the best cooker, and I had like everything was totally shut down in France, no restaurant, nothing. So I started to cook like different food around the world, like Moroccan food, like Spanish food. So it was a great, on that point, on that aspect, it was a nice experience.
Well done. Well, while Claire was learning how to cook Moroccan food and Spanish food, I was ordering it from the local takeaway. So didn't quite get into cooking myself. Okay, next up we have Dr. Maria Chatsu Dunford. If you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself, what you've done, and a fun lockdown hobby you took up in the last year.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. So I'm Maria, I'm CEO and founder of Lifebeat Ai. So Lifebeat is a company basically where we've created the world's only federated AI platform that provides access and analysis over different clinical and biomedical and genomics data. And currently, our technology is being deployed across many different organizations, government organizations, large pharmaceuticals, and other academic organizations to actually, as I said before, provide access and connect this distributed data. So a hobby I picked up over COVID, I guess, is just like a lot of people watching more Netflix than I used to before. And somehow now I'm kind of like immersed into more Asian movies. So I was like, okay, like what is it that is kind of like interesting in new culture? So that was fun.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think if we flash back last year, you could spend about 10 or 20 minutes looking through Netflix at things you haven't seen. And here we are today. It takes you 10 or 20 minutes to find something that you also haven't seen because we've pretty much completed Netflix, haven't we?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. Brilliant. And last but not least, we have Mr. Brad Perry. Brad, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about what you do and a fun lockdown hobby you took up.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Brad. I'm the head of artificial intelligence at AI Therapeutics, and our goal is to reposition drugs that we know are safe and treat rare diseases with large unmet clinical needs. So at the company, I oversee everything from scraping public data, turning that into proprietary data sets, generating our own unique data sets, and then of course building the algorithms that looks at all of this data, makes sense of compounds and diseases, and predicts new indications for drugs. And then from those indications, obviously we get them into clinic and make impacts on patient lives. As far as a lockdown hobby, I don't know that I necessarily picked up a new one, but with gyms closed and things, I'm a rock climber. So one thing I did is I built a huge outdoor climbing wall at my house. That's I think it's a total eyesore. But if you look at the housing market, at least in my area, there's this really strong correlation between when I put this climbing wall up and when all of the home prices exploded in the area. So I think I might have single-handedly improved the housing market in the area.
So when your neighbors look out the window, they're greeted by the back of a big, massive climbing wall. They must love you.
I'm sure they're really happy about it, for sure. Yeah.
Wow, brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you for those introductions. Great to have you all here and really looking forward to seeing what we can discuss within the area of AI in healthcare today. So again, like I said earlier, if there are any questions, do drop them into the Q&A box and we will try answer them as best we can. Andreas has just put into the chat that he's also a rock climber and also built his own wall during the pandemic. So Brad, you're not the only one building rock climbing walls.
Great.
Brilliant. So let's get into it then. So I guess one point that I wanted to touch on, and it's something that Brad brought up when we spoke a couple of weeks ago. So I guess there's been a lot of repositioning and repurposing of drugs within the pharmaceuticals industry. However, the argument can still be made that there's not a lot of AI and deep learning work being done within the drug prediction space. And I feel that with AI becoming so prominent in the healthcare field, I imagine more and more firms will start to utilize the power of artificial intelligence as a tool for drug prediction. So I wanted to direct a question first to you, Brad. Where do you see the future of AI going within the drug discovery space?
Yeah, I think it's going to be increasingly deeply integrated into most companies' R&D pipelines. There's a long way to go. So historically, this has been the space of cell biologists and bioinformaticians and people with greater clinical work. And there's been some barrier for deep learning and technology to get integrated. But certainly, if you look at the way investments are going, there's an increasing interest in grabbing this predictive technology, especially as new and more powerful algorithms are developed, and bringing it into effectively the clinic by, say, predicting new drug indications. But there's also a lot of barriers in the way. So most biological data that's really important for predicting biological relationships looks a lot different from many of the typical data sets that deep learning has been developed for. So there's some implicit bias in a lot of the algorithms. And because of that, you need a lot of deep domain expertise sort of layered over the deep learning or AI algorithms or whatever. And so right now there's basically this gap between the pure biologist and the more technical people. And so as we move toward, getting deep learning to having, or not even just deep learning, machine learning in general, having a greater role in predicting drugs, this talent gap is going to close, I think, where biologists will be increasingly aware of the machine learning technologies and vice versa, whether that just means that people are working more in a common language, or that there's, biologists are becoming increasingly quantitative, or deep learning people are understanding more and more the idiosyncrasies of biological data itself. But sorry.
No, go on. Sorry.
But I think it's also important to think more broadly than just a company wanting to like, hey, let's predict this one new treatment. I think it's going to impact a lot of areas of business, because if you're a pharma company, you have this new compound and you're about to file IP on it, you want to make sure you cover all of the use cases possible. And a great way to do that, of course, going through the literature and seeing what's already known about a particular target is great. But the great thing about deep learning algorithms, say if you're looking at gene expression data or proteomic, is they can find a lot of hidden features that a human scientist could miss. So it can really help these big pharma companies really file the best IP, hitting all of the use cases that they may have otherwise missed as well.
That's a good point. Good point. Maria, Claire, what are your thoughts? Where do you see the future of AI within the field of drug discovery?
I completely agree with Brad. AI will become common practice, but that's only because digitalization is becoming more of a common practice, right? Clinical trials used to, and still are, and will be for a while, go from we have a chemical molecule, and now let's test it in all possible solutions and mixes, and then from there to all mice and other animal models, and then from there, if not that many mice die, let's try to give it to humans, and then things fail, right? So you can see this is very manual and very not very data driven, I would say, right? It's experiment and error. What we will see happening is this whole drug development funnel flipping on its head, where you're going to go pretty much, and that's what we are already doing with the likes of the UK government and Genomics England, where you are now getting the data from the patients, from the hospitals, you are understanding the diseases, you are understanding their genetic profiles, and you're going from there to understand the pathways, the molecules, all of the functions that pretty much regulate a particular disease in a phenotype, in conjunction with all of the clinical expression data, genomics, other proteomics data, and so on and so forth. And then from there, you're walking backwards, and you are like, okay, now I have a clear target, and I have a clear function that regulates this disease, right? So it's about time I synthesize a chemical molecule rather than the other way around, right? And because we're going to be doing this, right, of course, any computational or data science technique that will allow us, obviously, to make that transition of the funnel much faster, much more automated, much more accurate, much more this and that, it will actually come to play, right? And obviously, AI is going to be part of that, but it's not just AI. It's a lot of we're going to have a lot of data-driven methodologies, technologies, platforms, collaborative if you like, tools that can bring, big minds, instead of looking at in a biology lab, looking at liquid things, looking at data screens and saying, okay, here's what we know about these patients. Here is, the stratification, the different ways. Here's the genetic background, how these combine with their clinical data, and so on and so forth, and walk backwards from there, right? So yeah, of course.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point as well. And Claire, you've worked a bit in the pharma industry as well. What are your thoughts on that, AI within drug discovery?
I agree with what was said before. I definitely think that it will at some point become a core practice. And again, I think that the digitalization in general cross industry definitely helps, because a key area regarding drug design and development is also to avoid all the side effects for the patient. And unfortunately, some data are lacking, because some patients are sometimes afraid to report some side effect because they're ashamed, or they don't want to speak to their doctor. And for instance, the fact now to have more and more secured more mobile apps, connected device will help also to bring back that information and to have something more accurate, because I think that at that point It's great that we have historical databases, but they are incomplete. So it will be a virtual cycle where, patient can be empowered, contribute also, for the improvement in the long term to drug development. And especially for patients with who have multiple pathologies, which are usually the most complicated cases to handle for medical doctors. So I think that what will be great is that now we have more and more access to those to those databases. There are more and more open source data regarding drugs and side effects, and the idea is really to mix those different sources. And I think that innovation will also come from collaboration, between public organization, the pharma industry, startup, the patient. It's not project that could be built alone, because you need also different expertise, as also was said before, and the contribution to everyone.
There's some very good points. And I think just quickly going back, Brad, when you were talking about that sort of gap, making biologists more aware of machine learning, deep learning, AI, and data science in general, I completely agree. I feel like not in all situations, but there does seem to be quite a gap between data science, deep learning, and then bioinformatics. My question to the panel is, how do we go about bridging that gap between the data science, the deep learning side, and bioinformatics?
I'll start off. I would say that, historically, biology is more of a qualitative, soft science. Certainly people are going to push back with me, and that's not universally the case, but most biologists have less quantitative training than a physicist does, and obviously than a mathematician, for example. And at the same time, if you look at deep learning in the AI field, they are also missing out on a lot of the the deep domain expertise in biology. That's also just a wealth of knowledge and a complicated system to understand. So I think it's really important to start at the education level. And on the one hand, it would be great to have biologists getting increasingly trained in different quantitative fields. Whether different math is going to be part of the curriculum, they have more exposure to physicists, or maybe directly some computer science or deep learning, machine learning classes. And it's going to be a big uphill battle for a lot of biologists.
So my personal opinion into this is like, we're not going to be closing this gap, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, right? It's a very big gap to close. And unless we can, I don't know, like clone knowledge in people's brain, or somehow miraculously kind of like, I don't know, generate new bioinformaticians out of nowhere, that gap is not going to be closed. So how do you close that gap? Well, you get technologies, you get pre-made platforms, right, that can automate a lot of the things. And then that is what you actually implement as the solutions, right? Because the question becomes, why do you even need to close that gap, right? And I think it's a little bit of like, naive to believe that, being myself a bioinformatician and have done through everything, like I've gone through like so many different transformations through my bioinformatics journey, where I started and pretty much the whole, gene and protein databases would fit like, my kind of like hard drive. And I didn't need to know anything more than Perl or script, right? So, and why would I need to do more than that, right? And I was majoring back then in algorithmics because that was the big thing, to then going to like progressively to an era where literally we created, one of the, or the main big data workflow language that is used in this sector, to kind of like, and that transition was like, now you need to kind of like thinking how you're architecting a completely new language and completely new systems that can work multi-cloud, multi-cluster with like petabytes of data and so on and so forth, right? And already that transition happened in one generation, right? And now that same generation is like, okay, now that you are finally kind of like AWS level, multi-cloud kind of like hacker, can you also become kind of like a Google, DeepMind AI kind of like scientist? Well, it's not going to happen. Let's be realistic. Some people will do it, right? I'm not, there are individuals out there like phenomenal, but the masses, of course, they're not going to do that, because their masses are still catching up with the fact, like, we moved from a computer to like, oh, I need clusters, and we moved from like data fitting a hard drive to, oh, I all of a sudden have petabytes of data. And also these data are now not just like one type of genomic data, it's like all types of multi-omics data and clinical data, right? So bioinformaticians are just too busy and too overwhelmed catching up with where we are, right? Data set diversity, size of data, different multi-clouds and high-performance computing environments, NNN, right? So it's just naive and unrealistic to say, like, on top of that, I expect you to be like, DeepMind level AI expert. Like, it's not going to happen. For some individuals that are going to focus and major into that, of course. And especially if I look on like how we train actually bioinformaticians at Lifebeat, we hire bioinformaticians kind of like for every types of like backgrounds, if you like. But then the moment we get them in the company, we give them a specialization, and then we specialize them in something. And we either specialize them in big data or AI or big pipeline analytics. And we have a couple of more areas pretty much, right? It's just impossible for them to specialize in all of these things at once, right? They get general knowledge, but like it's not possible, right? So that's why you just like, buy technologies, you work with companies like Lifebeat to deploy those things much faster. Having said that, there are a lot of advancements happening, right? Like over the past couple of years, we see almost an exponential increase in Nature and Science papers and all of the science paper around how AI is being deployed in this field, right? And we see even like a lot of like community things, like the Keepoi repository has more than 2,000 kind of like deep learning and all types of learning models ready out of the box for this sector, and so on and so forth, right? But again, even with that pace, we're not going to bridge this gap in the next, for sure, 5 years, maybe 10, right?
Yeah. So I'm not advocating. Yeah, so I'm not advocating that bioinformaticians become, like DeepMind level deep learning scientists. I mean, because actually most deep learning scientists are not going to be DeepMind level scientists. What I mean more is, understanding the technique and understanding, in general, how things work so that they can employ it effectively. I mean, for sure, bioinformaticians are not going to be, most likely writing the next generation of deep learning algorithms. I agree. It's more about understanding the tool and technology to use it the most effectively.
I will still argue that even that, for the majority of bioinformaticians out there, beyond obviously what it's easy to emulate and apply, it's already a very hard task to ask, right? And it's not going to be bridged easily even in the next 5 years, no matter if they pretend they're taking a couple of courses at Coursera, right? Like, for sure, it's going to be great and we'll take them somewhere, or like, but it's like, someone being a biologist and then calling themselves bioinformatician because they did some R Shiny classes, right? Or some R classes online. Like, it's great. They will be able to do more than they were previously, but that's kind of like the level of bioinformaticians that I think like can happen in the next 5 years for people starting obviously from ground zero.
Sure, but it can be the difference between a bioinformatician being able to work with a pure deep learning scientist and not being able to work with them.
Our experience at Lifebeat shows the contrary, but well, I wouldn't say shows the contrary, but I would, again, it really depends on what you want to do. Like, our experience so far, really, it's, like you need quite a lot of expertise to be able to say that I'm effectively now working with someone that, has been doing NLP deep learning for like, 10 years. And I have a bioinformatician that just take a couple of Coursera courses. Like, no, they need a bit more time, right? To get where they need to be to even work effectively together. Again, I'm not doubting here that, we're not the absolute hold, basically we don't hold the absolute truth. So I'm sure that there might be other experiences. Our experience at Lifebeat is definitely not that.
Brilliant. All right, thank you for your opinions there. I think that was a very, very interesting discussion between the two of you. Claire, I'm not sure if you had any opinion to add on that matter.
Yeah, regarding that subject between the gap between biology and info and IT in general, um, me from my previous experience, what I see is now to do AI in healthcare, we really need multidisciplinary teams. Because we need high quality and strong validation. I'm thinking especially in Europe, where for instance, if you use AI for diagnostic or to help the diagnostic, it's considered as a medical device. So you need to apply, like if it's a medical device. So it's a lot of norms and standard operational procedure to handle. And in order to have different experts working together, I think that they need to find a common language for collaboration. And at the moment, I know that, for instance, in France, we are starting to have more and more master degrees specialized in data science in healthcare. It's not bioinformatics, but at least to starting to have more industry specific trainings and master degrees and higher education. However, I think at the moment, I agree that it's more at the company level that we need to handle that. For instance, that's what I did in my previous job as at Excelia, was I was a director of data science, and it was a contract research organization. And for data science project, we had clinical project managers, biostatistician, and data scientists working together. And what I did is creating with the team some learning path. Okay, how do we onboard a biostatistician for data science project? How do we onboard a clinical project manager? Again, they will not be expert, but again, the idea is to find a common language, to be able also to check to see if the results are making sense. And the ultimate goal is to limit bias within those algorithms, because we are talking about patient lives. I've worked in the banking sector, in the social media sector in the past. Of course, your user and client data are key, but the difference here in that industry is that, not on all projects, but on a lot of them, you are handling the life of the patient. So, having any bias or any bugs is not something that you can consider and accept for those projects regarding artificial intelligence in healthcare.
Brilliant. No, there were some very good points on that topic. Again, if there are any other opinions or any questions from anyone attending the panel, do please drop that into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get around to as many of them as we can at the end of the discussion. Brilliant. And I think another area that I wanted to bring up that I think is definitely evolving with artificial intelligence is essentially its application within clinical trials, right? So we know AI has had a great impact improving diagnostics based on medical imaging, and the fact that we are still in the very early stages of AI within clinical trials and for evidence-based medicine. Claire, I'd be keen to direct this at you to start off. How do we see this evolving in the future as more and more companies utilize AI and it continues to expand in the healthcare organization?
I think it will be key because at the moment, if we are speaking, worldwide, very few patients are aware that they can join clinical trials, which could be really important and key if for very serious pathology. It's also patient education regarding that. But having, for instance, automated matching between patient profiles and clinical trials to help medical doctor to say, hey, your patient can join those clinical trials, and especially on, at an international level, because clinical trials usually are run within different regions. I think it will be key, and the idea is really to accelerate. I think that we have also a language barrier. I can see it, in Europe, because there are big databases which are only in English, and we have over clinical trial databases in local languages, for instance in French. So how do we match that? There is a lot of data engineering, I think, to do prior to that, but I definitely think that we are at the beginning of great improvements on that area. And another point regarding clinical trial, after a part of patient recruitment, it's also historical data, how patient had reaction for specific drug, what were the side effects. And again, we need collaboration between a pharmaceutical company, public organization that have those data, in order to see what we could find, which links, which insights, gathering those databases.
Yeah, that's a good point. Brad, Maria, I'm not sure what would your thoughts be on that topic. Do you have an opinion?
I think already what Claire said kind of like summarizes the status of the sector, right? Like definitely one of the biggest challenges is the fact that that we have data in different formats, different languages, segregated and distributed across the whole world. A lot of times, very much siloed and inaccessible is something that at Lifebeat we built this company to actually literally address that problem. So definitely it's a really, really big problem, and it's going to keep, and it's actually an ever growing problem, because not only that's the state of things, but we're actually keep generating more and more data in exactly that state, right? The other big problem, obviously, with clinical trials is the fact that it's very difficult to even properly find patients to join clinical trials, and then from there even kind of like do proper stratification of patients, right? Which patients should go to the appropriate clinical trials? How are we convinced that, even with our involvement in the clinical trial, how can we be convinced that the drug will work, right? And also, of course, there is another big, I would say, issue from especially patient perspective is a lot of patients that go for clinical trials, they actually want to be getting the drug of the clinical trial, not the placebo. And obviously that's a big demotivating factor for a lot of patients, where they don't really know if they're going to be getting the real drug or the placebo, right? So there is a lot of different issues that have to be solved there. And all of these are areas where definitely AI can help, especially when it comes to identifying and even recommending from hospitals, right? When patients go to their doctors to here are the clinical trials, here are some drugs that you could actually be admitted to, from obviously then the further stratification of the patients, even when they are within the clinical trials. And definitely, of course, we can deploy quite a lot of AI technology to, use all of our technology around language translation and standardization of data and so on and so forth, to try to kind of bridge the gap between the different formats and types of data that we have.
Yeah, very interesting point. And I think just on clinical trials, obviously it's become a very common thing with the vaccines for coronavirus. And of course, I guess it would be silly not to address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that we are in a pandemic, and COVID is something we've been dealing with for the last year. Maria, I guess I'd be keen to direct this at you to start off with. In the future, do you think AI will reach a point where we'll be able to predict the next big disease, the next big pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. It's actually something we're already doing. So with a couple of our big pharmaceutical clients, we've already deployed with them a disease detection system. And that system does pretty much uses real world evidence data and does active learning and flags across the world, right, where we have emerging diseases and how those diseases are spreading. And then from there, the system is able to start already, once it kind of detects that a disease starts spreading towards kind of like, let's say, alarming ways, it starts already profiling kind of like, okay, which groups are going to be affected, what's going to be kind of like the, if you like, how the disease is going to kind of like grow, right? And then from there, it even, which is the first thing, and obviously it kind of like alarms the right people. And then from there, it kind of like this whole system goes and finds what could be possible drugs and molecules and treatments that could be used against this disease. And then from there, it kind of even like digs further deeper into identifying kind of like all of the known information about everything known about this disease, right? The molecular functions, the pathways that are being activated, and then working backwards from those, the genes, and then identify kind of like a potential like target, the potential different target mechanisms that we could actually target with different drugs, right? And now we're even putting into that actually functionality that will be able to inform the system about stratification of different patients, because that was the biggest problem that we had with COVID, right? We had to lock down a whole country. Why is that? Because you don't know really who is going to respond to COVID in an asymptomatic way, so no problem, and who are going to respond to COVID in a way that they're going to end up into the intensive care unit and potentially even lose their lives, right? And this is the big project one of the big projects we're doing with the UK government and Genomics England, where the Lifebeat platform is now used to provide access and analysis to all of UK's COVID data coming from 35,000 patients with COVID, right? And already the analysis of this data has already and made it to Nature papers and other like prestigious magazine have already identified kind of like the genes that seem to be stratifying and explaining the susceptibility to COVID. So why certain people will have a really, really bad response, and why others are going to be completely asymptomatic, right? And you want your future AI systems not only to start surveilling the different disease outbreaks that you have across the world, but once something starts spreading in an alarming way, can actually give head starts of like, these are going to be the countries and the regions that's going to be affected. This is going to be all of the known data around potential treatments, drugs that can be used. This is how, the different biological mechanisms. This is what we can see in terms of genetics, kind of like patient stratification level, who can be affected. And obviously, you're going to have a lot of missing data around this, and that's what we are finding, but it is really amazing to see actually that AI can actually, or AI systems, because it's not just a kind of like a shallow AI algorithm, but intelligent systems can actually inform all of these things. And obviously they will get it wrong, and they're going to get missing information wherever there is missing information. But you can easily see that what will happen in the next years, which is really, really exciting, is that once you have more and more of this data, then these systems will be able to tell you, okay, this is what's happening, and this is what's going to hit us next, and here's how you need to start planning around it, right?
Yeah. Brad, Claire, what are your thoughts on that topic, using AI to predict what could be the next pandemic? Great point there, Maria.
Yeah, I think there's a huge divide in, predicting versus early detection. So as far as predicting, the viral configuration space that could, produce a pandemic is, let's say, basically infinite. And you could predict a massive number of, different viruses that could produce a pandemic without being able to say which one's going to be the next one. So I think predicting is basically impossible. But as far as early detection and surveillance, I mean, I think that's much more reasonable. Maria outlined a bunch of different approaches to survey data and look at, spreading and different features of diseases and so on. So I think that's possible, but I would be careful about tying AI to predicting the next pandemic, because that's sort of like a flashy thing to say, and then when it doesn't do it inevitably, it's like, oh well, your technology failed. But I don't know that that's like a real thing that we could do.
I agree with what is said. I think that we can We can do early detection. We can also help to predict the most appropriate response if we are starting to see an early pandemic. A very interesting project, I think, is the one by the World Health Organization, which is called API Brain, and which is basically a global warning system using shared data. And the idea is really to, with artificial intelligence, to have better management of oncoming pandemics. And I really believe that like a project like that represents for me one of the first phase to an overhaul pandemic management at an international level, which is key if we want to manage next crisis in the future, which we all hope will not happen that much, but in case to have a better response at the international level.
Yeah, and so there was a question put into the chat that I had intended to ask when we were on this topic. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask that one. But the question was essentially around, do you think that the use of AI at the beginning of COVID by the government could have made a more positive impact on the spread of the virus or not? What are your thoughts on that one?
I would say that just doing a better job of having the data available, like I would say forget the government using AI. I would just say make the data available faster so that the people who are good at applying AI to biological data can start working with it as quickly as possible. And there were very, in some places that was done a lot better than others, but the lack of consistency at the beginning, I think, really slowed the possible response.
Yeah, I will 100% agree with Brad here, right? Data is like donating data, and making data available is like donating blood and making blood available, right? Like it's absolutely critical when it comes to human health, right? And I think there was a big campaign across UK and also many different places saying that, right? Like data is like blood when it comes to healthcare. We absolutely need it, right? And definitely that was the number one problem. But even when we go beyond that, I will say, yes, let's have a government bloody use AI and all of the other technologies that are needed. For me, it was unacceptable that we were months and months in and governments were still debating, oh, is this going to develop into a huge pandemic? Is this going to hit Europe? Like Italy was just like, like any even like, having, as I said, deployed early detection systems and disease surveillance and all of that, right? Like even the most shallow thing that could be just developed by, like someone with like 3-4 years of like machine learning kind of like experience could have actually give you that answer. Yet the governments were still debating it, right? And it's just like, why are we doing that? In 2020, when we have all of this technology, right? Like it should not come down to like people debating. And I think that is a big problem, right? Like we have so many data, so many statistics showing how different diseases spread, right? We have seen this historically, like, yes, this might be the first kind of like big pandemic, but like, I mean, we've seen so many kind of like more localized, disease spreads. We know this. We have all of the models, all of the math, right? This is nothing new, right? If we were back, I don't know, in 2020 and we were lacking the technology, the math, we know we have not really studied diseases and how disease spread, I would be like, okay, like it's a matter of getting all of these things first. But no, here was an absolute failure simply because the governments did not use the technology that they could have used. And yes, even AI, if it comes down to that being one of the technologies that could have helped here, but even before AI, there were so many other technologies, right? Just simple statistics, just simple data science onto this, right? They could have already given you the answers, right? And from there, if we kind of like even extrapolate that into the management of the hospitals, like people were like, everyone in their right minds were like, the healthcare system is going to collapse, right? And they were still kind of like debating, no, let's like do herd immunity. And it's just like, how do you do herd immunity in London? 10 million people. To do herd immunity, you need at the minimum 1% of these people to get sick. If you get 1%, it's just 1 million. Can your hospitals even, have 1 million people at one go? NHS already almost like collapsed on a kind of like a normal day, right? Like, so it just didn't make sense in so many ways. And you were like why politicians do even debate on these things? Why, as governments, as nations, right, as the developed world that we are, right, we don't have systems in place where things do not end up being a matter of debate. It's just like like no one debates the weather. When the weatherman says like it's going to rain tomorrow, well, get an umbrella, right? Like no one really debates that. We don't have like road shows on like, will it work or not? And I do believe we need to get our healthcare system to exactly the same level where, the equivalent of a weatherman kind of like in a weather system says, this is the next thing is going to hit us, right? And it might rain a lot, it might not rain that much or whatever, right? We might maybe get wrong, but we are going to be, it's not a matter of debate. The only debate is like, how many umbrellas do we get out there, right? Like we need to prepare.
Yeah. Go on, Claire, sorry.
Sorry. No, on my point of view, like government and politics aside, I think that it's more to have like, again, a common environment for researcher to be able to detect weak signals and, to be able also to work on patient similarity. Oh, we are starting to have like 10, 100, 1,000 patients in different countries, they have the same symptoms, maybe something is going on. So it's backing up to the previous topic, where I think there are a lot of room for improvement for early detection. And also I think that we need a collaboration also, from different industries. I'm thinking also about search engines, because a few years ago Google predict, at least in France, a flu pandemic. So flu, it's not extremely serious, we have vaccine for that, but just based on the research of the patient, because with the symptoms. So I think that there is really room for collaboration cross industry, again, to have a space, especially in medical research, for collaboration, and especially the detections of early signals of pandemics or new disease in general.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, and it's definitely one that I wanted to touch on, of course, with everything that is going on. But some great opinions there, guys. Thank you for your insight on that one. So just before we're going to go into the Q&A shortly, because conscious of time, of course, but just before we go into that, sort of as one final question to the panel, and of course, keeping with the topic of this being the future and the evolution of artificial intelligence, my question to you all is, what excites you about AI in the future?
I guess I'll go. So what excites me about AI? I think that AI has been a really newsy thing to talk about, and there's been a lot of hype and excitement about it. And I think that sort of died down. And in the meantime, all of the machine learning, deep learning scientists have been working really hard on theory and making some really interesting new advances. And I think what's happening right now is the foundation is being laid for the sort of the next generation of these algorithms. And I think that they're starting to show up. But as all of this hard work comes more and more into fruition, I think we're going to see really, really amazing advances in the field that are hard to comprehend exactly what type of impact they're going to have. But I think they'll show up, and the impacts will be pretty dramatic really quickly when they do.
And to second what Brand said, the same thing holds true for data. We're now generating a lot of data that we were just not doing that before, right? And this pandemic has only kind of like sped that up, right? We have especially when we think about population health, uh, let's say, was never as funded as it has been now, ever before in the human history. And we're generating a lot of data, and the governments now pay attention to that much more. They put it into their kind of like agendas. But it's not just the governments, companies are now being more mindful about that. We discussed about how the drug discovery is going to be much more data driven rather than kind of like, like trial and error and symptom driven, right? So there is a lot of data generation happening. The problem is that, as we also discussed before, these data are generated in a distributed fashion across all corners of Earth, and also in many different types, shapes, forms, sizes, and so on and so forth. So definitely we need systems that not only are AI driven, so they're very smart systems, but also they can actually are federated systems that they can actually deal with like the distributed nature of the data, as well as with the non-standardized nature of the data.
And on my side, what excites me regarding AI in healthcare is really the philosophy of thinking that we can use AI for good and have a positive impact on patient's life. The fact that also like using the expertise of everyone to make those projects happen. A data scientist will never be a medical doctor, but again, we need to find a common language to have everyone interested on that. So I had the opportunity to work on great project. Last year I worked with Bristol Myers Squibb regarding patient retention in rheumatology. So how we use the AIs to predict which patient will continue their treatment or not. Now, working at Resilience for oncologies with an oncologist, full stack developer, a data scientist. So I think we are in a great time where we are starting to have more data available, more tools to analyze them, and also a stronger willingness to share and to interact within the medical community. And again, the pandemic showed that we have some improvement to do, but I'm confident on the future of AI for healthcare.
Yeah, some great points there from all of our panelists. I think personally the whole area of AI really excites me, even with what it's currently able to do, such as, AI is used in healthcare to change people's lives, to save people's lives, to identify and treat critical illnesses at a faster rate. And if that's what it's able to do today, I'm just excited to see what it will bring in the future. Brilliant. So we're going to try and get through a few questions now. Conscious of time, we won't get to go through them all, but we'll try and get through ideally 2 or 3 anyway. So first question I've picked out here is from William. So William is asking the panelists, sensitive data like patient data and measurements are protected by local serious privacy regulations. Do you think AI modules can have access to make diagnostics, not decisions, but forecasts, recommendations for documents?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see what the hangup is exactly, because data can be anonymized. Maybe there's something else that I'm missing from the question, though.
So I guess what he's asking is, will AI have access to make diagnostics, given the fact that sensitive data like patient data is protected by privacy regulations?
Well, yeah, it can.
Sorry,
go for
ahead,
it, Maria.
Brad.
Or Claire, sorry.
No, go ahead, Brad.
Data can be sufficiently anonymized. I don't see that as as a major problem.
Yeah, and there is something called federated machine learning. So there we go. I think that solves most of the problems, right? Like where you can actually, and it's a very real thing. I mean, Google runs federated ML in every kind of like Android phone, if you like, right? So it can run completely distributed over kind of like, and can learn from the data where the data sits without needing to move the data and then obviously expose any sensitive information around the data. Again, this is something that we do at Lifebeat, but we're not the only company that does this, right? And we do it more particularly for clinical and genomics and multi-omics data, but like other companies do it for also other types of data.
Okay, yeah, good points there. An interesting question here from Sophie. Do you think we can get to a point where tech and AI eliminates a substantial level of clinical trials?
Yeah. So we should absolutely be able to refine, the trials we start by, pre-selecting, say, compounds or the patient population, and only doing trials and, basically having a higher percentage of successful trials. And there are a lot of companies doing that. And that's a trend that I see is increasing.
Yep. The other important thing here is that's definitely one approach, and it is an approach that is here to persist and is going to grow, exactly as Brad said. And I mean, like, people like Brad is kind of like pioneering some of that, right? But another approach is pretty much, again, what we've been doing with the UK government and Genomics England, where now you are getting data from the hospitals already, from the patients, right? And then you think like, oh, but, and I explained before how we have 35,000 data or data from 35,000 patients, all clinical records and genomics data, right? And one would say like, oh, but Maria, that was only for COVID. Yeah, but like these patients don't only suffer from COVID, right? They have so many other things. And even, Brad also highlighted before that, COVID is just one type of virus from a big class of different viruses. So understanding how that works, you are understanding how a big class of viruses work. But more importantly, viruses are a big part of what causes a lot of infectious diseases. So by understanding and doing that, you understand how a lot of infectious diseases work, right? Which obviously, using smart systems and data scientists and NN, you can very much approximate and say like, okay, this is what happened in this case, but what we can see from these patients with different diseases is that this is what will happen in kind of like, if you like, similar clinical trials or similar diseases, similar drugs, and so on and so forth. So of course that, shortcuts is what we actually call as like bringing clinical trials to the real world, or actually taking the data from the clinical trials that are happening in the real world within hospitals, within kind of like the overall clinical trials, and bringing it back and simulating and emulating from that, and kind of like in silico running, many different new clinical trials for different drugs, different diseases, and yeah, different scenarios, if you like.
And yeah, regarding that, I think that what everybody in the industry wants to do is to be at a point where we have only virtual clinical trials. And I'm not talking about decentralized clinical trials, but really clinical trials that does not involve like real patient, that's using a lot of historical data. We can do like virtual cohort. So it's all in the space, what we call in silico clinical trials. It's very, very early stage, but the idea is to accelerate, because for drug, the average it's 10 years to get it on the market, from the whole research and development, then the clinical trials and all the approbation. So we could say that at least for the vaccines for COVID-19, it's feasible to accelerate those. But I personally think that at some point, not now, we can even have a shorter time to market for new drugs and medical device using AI in order to have 100% in silico or virtual clinical trials.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we have time. We'll do one more question. There was one put in there to the chat from Eliza. Eliza asks, how do you see the future of deep learning applied to imaging to improve early diagnosis? For example, radiomics applied to cardiovascular imaging.
I'd like to jump in. So there's a company that's part of the incubator that I work with. They're called Butterfly. If anyone isn't familiar, you should definitely check out Butterfly. But they make a portable ultrasound device, and they're doing amazing things with technology and imaging. And them, along with a couple other companies like Hyperfine, are going to be companies that are really driving the space forward, in my opinion.
Apart from that, already the NHS is working, and I cannot say much, but is working on actually deploying pretty much federated machine learning on imaging data to roll out diagnostics throughout the whole doctors. And it's something that's going to be out there in the next couple of years, well, given everything.
And in France also, we have the laboratory of medical imaging which is working on similar topics. But I think the idea is more, the human can perceive some, information on a radio or MRI, but the machine can also see similarities between patients that the eye cannot see. And I think that's where it's interesting to have AI in diagnostic, is how we are going beyond what the human could see, and to see insights or patterns. We're talking about a lot of texture analysis for medical imaging. So how we use the machines to be even better. That's what we are doing in terms of humans. And there are a lot of more and more startups in that field that have great results regarding the diagnostics based on medical imaging.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's about all the time we have for the questions. Any questions that were not answered, we will get around to answering them on our LinkedIn page over the coming days. Just before we wrap up, we're just going to put a second poll up on the screen. If you could all just cast your votes on that one. As that goes up, so there it is there. So if you can't see it, what do you see as the main advantage of using advanced computers or robotics with AI for healthcare? That healthcare information is more accessible, faster, more accurate diagnosis, advanced solutions, increased convenience, security, improved treatment recommendations, easy analysis of results, on-demand healthcare specialists, and better customer service. So while you're casting your votes on that one, I just want to thank everyone for sharing your morning, your evening, or your lunchtime with us, depending on where you are watching from. Massive thank you to our speakers, Brad, Claire, and Maria. You've been amazing. Your insights were extremely interesting. And to our amazing audience as well for participating. We hope you can all join us for our next webinar, which will also be focused on AI. That will be taking place in May, the details of which will be announced in the coming weeks. For those that wish to continue the discussion further, please do join our networking rooms. There's a live link in the chat here. You'll be able to meet our panel and discuss various topics. We'll be splitting off into those networking rooms shortly, but that's it for me. Thank you for everyone attending, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank
you very much.
Everyone, bye-bye.